It's wonderful to be here, especially having a live audience. A month ago, I gave this talk for the History Hounds, which is the Michigan Historical Society lecture series. And I was talking to over 100 people on a Zoom call, and I had absolutely no interaction with any of them. And that was tough when you're talking to your water bottle. So it's a lot nicer to have some faces and somebody to talk to. So really glad to be here tonight. And I've spent a couple of days in the archives here finding some more things that will be included in this talk. So that was kind of like the icing on the cake. So just really glad to be here and be able to share what I've been able to find out about the Old Wing mission. So like Eric said, I have known about this for about 50 years. I grew up in Holland, about 2 miles as the crow flies, 3 miles as the road goes to get to it. So we would occasionally drive by it. And in 1969, it became a state historical site. So then it had the green sign in front of it. So you were able to find out, some of the history of it, which, just added to my fascination, because besides being a scientist, I've always been somebody who's been fascinated by history. And just to kind of get going on this. So, just to give you an idea of sort of where this talk is going, for those of you who know somewhat about the Old Wing mission, wonderful. If not, just to give you a really quick overview, the Old Wing mission, its roots go back to 1839, and Reverend George Smith, who was a Congregationalist missionary who was in the area, he teamed up with Chief Wakazoo Jr., the second of the 3 chiefs named Wakazoo, and they decided to allow the Indians to stay in this area. They had to form a mission. So they combined their forces together and set up this mission. So we'll talk a whole bunch about that. 10 years later, when my Dutch ancestors arrived, 2,000 of them in about a year, the Native Americans said, "We are so out of here," that they moved up to the Leelanau Peninsula, and they were able to sell their land and get rid of it. So it was sad that they had to go, but it could have been a heck of a lot worse, if that makes sense. And there were about a half a dozen buildings associated with the Old Wing mission, and one of them has survived, which is the house that was on the front slide. And it's been there since somewhere between 1844 and 1846. It took a while to build it. Not that it was that large of a house, but it was just the financial costs of it, that it took some time for them to get the money together. And then LG Energy Solutions purchased the land in 2023. They have their battery factory there, and they're undergoing expansions. They're doing one now, and they're getting ready to do another one. But the house is still there. I drove by it on my way here, and I can literally say it is still here. So that's good news, and part of my hope and mission is to do whatever I can to keep that house standing. And just always looking for people who are interested in that to help me out. And I think I probably see some allies in here, so that's good. So where is it? Hopefully you can see this. This is a map of Holland. And the Old Wing mission is located here, which is on 40th Street. This is Country Club. No, excuse me, that's Waverly with Country Club on the other side. It's pretty much right in the middle of there on 40th Street. Here's US 31. Saugatuck's down here, Lake Makatawa. I also want to point out Wakazoo Woods, and that's where the Native Americans really wanted to stay, and they were able to stay there until 1835, when a small town by the name of Superior was formed in Holland, right here, with about a dozen buildings. And when that happened, the people who bought the land for Superior owned that land, and they made the Indians move. And where the Indians moved was just to the other side of the lake here, which is what's referred to as the landing, and that's where Heinz Pickle is. So, so those are kind of the sites that we're talking about. And if you want to blow in where the Old Wing mission house is, if you're familiar with section numbers, this is section number 3. This is section number 4 in Allegan County, so it's right on the border. And the house is literally in the middle of section 3, and it was mainly in this area that the Native Americans were allowed to buy land by the federal government to form this mission. And then when the Dutch moved in, then they actually were able to sell the land for good prices. So that's kind of a background of kind of where we're going. So, and if you have questions about content, feel free to ask me at any time. If you got questions like you want to go down some other trail or a rabbit hole or something, I've got a lot of information. Glad to discuss that at the end, and stick around till Eric kicks me out. And you know, if you want to buy me a beer, I'll stick around even longer. So, but yeah, so that's where we are. We have lots and lots of primary documents. And a lot of you probably are familiar with a guy by the name of Chuck Lawrence, who was one of the founders here, wrote multiple books on Saugatuck and the area around here. He got really interested in the Old Wing Mission, like in the late 1970s, 1980s. And he was able to start collecting this information. And then he got Bob Zwieringa, who's one of the historians, who writes really big, thick, heavy books, and a guy named Bill Van Apeldoorn. They worked together and they put this book together. And what Chuck had started to do was he realized that Reverend George Smith had a series of diaries that he kept from the time he became a missionary till when he died. And only one of those diaries was missing, which was the one from 1847, which would have been nice because that's when the Dutch arrived. But all the rest of them are available, and what he did was he included all of those diaries in this book. The other thing is that his Reverend George Smith's wife, Arvilla, also had diaries. She kept them for a while, then she wrote memoirs later in her life. I always laugh at this because this is a copy of one of the pages from Reverend Smith's diary. Its handwriting is about as good as mine. He really looks like he was a scientist or a mathematician, kind of like I was. And his wife was probably the English teacher because they were both high school teachers. And I mean, her stuff reads absolutely great. And Reverend Smith is a little rough, but it's still fun to read. So they also included in here all of the annual mission reports. So there's about 100 pages of reports that they would send either to the state of Michigan, federal government, or the Congregationalists, or the Presbyterians that were giving money towards the mission. So they've got these absolutely wonderful summaries of what was going on. They included genealogies of the Smith and the Wakazoo families. And what was interesting is Reverend Smith's oldest daughter married into the Wakazoo family, and they became the family historians. So they were very, very interested in keeping information on both families. So like I said, it's just absolutely overwhelming with stuff, 700 pages. And then they dedicated the book to Chuck Lawrence, just because he really was the person who started putting it together. And I was having so much fun in your archives because I was looking at all of these things where he was starting to gather things in, put lists together, and I'll show some of those as we go along. So there was a couple of other sources of information. This is Eric Hemingway. He is associated with the Odawa tribes up in northern Michigan, and he is a historian for his specific tribe. And he gave a talk for the Holland Museum on Zoom. It's available on the Holland Museum website. And it's really fascinating because it gives the whole Reverend Smith story from the Native American perspective. One of the things that he did was say, I really don't know the other perspective, the Dutch, the Caucasian perspective, which is part of the reason why I really wanted to put this talk together. And when the museum asked me to do this about 2 years ago, I pretty much immediately said yes. By that time, I knew that there was also something up with the Old Wing Mission, and being a docent, people would always ask questions about it. What really is the story? And I knew enough to be dangerous, not enough to be good. I'm still probably in the dangerous area, but I know a little bit more. So. And then we also have our archives at the Holland Museum, which has a lot of really great original documents that I'll have pictures of also. I just lose myself in there. I'm terrible, but they tolerate me. So what's going to be discussed tonight? We'll talk a bit about the Odawa history for the Native Americans in the area. We'll talk about the chief's Wakazoo. And one thing I do want to point out is that there's multiple spellings of it. Quite often here, in Holland at least, it's Waukazoo. I found a signature for Peter Wakazoo, who was the third chief, and this is the way that he signed it, so that's the way I decided to use it in this talk. I also usually refer to them as Native Americans. I also say Odawa instead of Ottawa. Occasionally I'll slip up and say something different, but it's with respect, and it's about what I can say. Talk about what was going on in Michigan and in the United States in the 1820s and the 1830s that led for the need for the Old Wing Mission. We'll talk about the Old Wing Mission, what all went on, what happened during those 10 years. And also I'll give some background on Reverend George Smith and how he fit into all of this, and how he sort of showed up at just the right time to be able to do the things that needed to be done. We'll talk about the arrival of the Dutch, and then what I refer to as the interlude between 1849, when the Native Americans went north up to the Leelanau Peninsula, and until 2023, there was a series of owners, including Chuck Lawrence and his family, that really liked and were very, they understood the Old Wing Mission and really did what they could to protect it. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll talk about what's been going on lately with LG, Energy Solutions, and hopefully try to predict the future, but you really don't know until you get there. So I'm a paranoid optimist. So I think things are going to go good, but at the same time, it's like I need to keep on it to make sure that they go as well as I can make them. So if that makes sense. So background on the Odawa Indians. They were members of the People of the Three Fires, which is a confederation between the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe tribes. They are very close together. They intermingle, they intermarry, but yet they still have some differences between the three of them, and they're really focused here in the Michigan area. They, as a group, migrated from eastern North America to the Great Lakes region approximately 500 years ago. That seems to be the story that most of them tell. There's also some people that will say we've been here forever. I respect both stories. I just go with what they want to say, and that's fine with me. They were always nominally Catholic. They had close relationships with the French. A few did really convert to be Catholics, but most of them respected that as a religion for the white men. And in 1800, there were approximately 10,000 Native Americans in the Michigan area. And that was down from before, so they were already, a lot of diseases were starting to wipe out the Native Americans by that time. The Odawa homeland, there's really two areas where they were focused. They had this this area in lower Michigan, draw a line straight up and down, and then across by Holland and Saugatuck. And in that area to the northwest of there really were two clusters of Native Americans. One was along the Grand River, and they tended to stay there most of the time. There was another cluster up by Little Traverse Bay, Charlevoix, Petoskey, north of there, and they tended to move around more. What Eric said in his presentation, he had a picture of this, there had been villages all over Michigan. So it's not like they were just there. They would stay somewhere for a few years, or the resources would dry up, they'd move somewhere else. They had lots of space. But what would happen with these Native Americans, they would quite often spend their summers up there. They would quite often go to Mackinac Island in August. Quite often there was a rendezvous there, and if they had, if they had signed treaties and they had, trade goods coming for them, that's usually where they were given those trade goods. And then during the winter, they would quite often come further down south, and Holland was about the first area that they would come to. And what they would do is make maple sugar, and they literally would make tons and tons of maple sugar, and use that to sell to the Americans in the area, or even all the way down to Chicago to make some money. And so they always kind of had this migration pattern, kind of like a lot of retirees, south during the winter, north during the summer, you go to the big party, stuff like that. It really wasn't that bad of a lifestyle. There was always food to eat, there was always fish around. So, overall, it was very healthy. Let's talk about the Wakazoo family. And when I was talking about the tribes that were up in that northwest corner, by Charlevoix, they really had 4 chiefs around 1800, and they were all brothers. one of which was Chief Joseph Wakazoo, who I'm going to be talking about. Another one was his brother Wing, who Old Wing Mission was named after. And then there were two other brothers, and these were all very, very important chiefs. And some of them fought for the Americans during the War of 1812. Some of them fought for the British. We're not quite sure who Joseph Wakazoo fought, if he even fought at all. But they really were dominant as far as the people that were leading the tribes. So then we're talking about the three chiefs. Wakazoo, Joseph Sr. had some connections to Lake Winnipeg up in Canada. And he would spend some of his time there, he would spend some of it in Michigan, and go back and forth. And he had a group of 100 to 300 Native Americans that, and by about 1815, he was mainly staying in Michigan. And between him and his sons, they would spend their summers, Little Traverse Bay area, and then go south for the winter. And a lot of it was in Holland, Waukazoo Woods. That's kind of how it got its name. That was their favorite place to go. So Joseph Sr. lived from about 1760 to 1835. His wife was Choni, and then he had 3 kids. His oldest child that lived to adulthood was Charlotte Kinnequa, and she was a very famous healing woman for the Native Americans. Chuck got about an 8 or 10 to 10 page document from the family, the historian part of the family, that talks about her life and various stories of her. That really it's something that needs to be distributed much wider, just because there's just not that many stories about Native American women. You get past Pocahontas and Sacagawea, and there's not much else. And this is somebody who really did make a difference. Then there was Joseph Jr., who lived from about 1805 to 1845, and his wife was Tepita, and Peter Wakazoo, who was the younger son. And he had several wives. Everybody seemed to die, so I didn't include them. But yeah, it's just great that there's all this information available. So what was going on in Michigan and also in the United States? In Michigan, there's this whole series of treaties. If you go to Wikipedia, there's about 1.5 pages of them. And looking at the ones that affected the Odawa, the first one was the first Treaty of Chicago. And in this treaty, what they did is they gave up all of their land to the Americans up to the Grand River. And for them, there were about 4 Americans in the land at that time, and they were able to use it as long as they wanted, as long as the Americans didn't take it. So, they're kind of like, hey, we're getting this free money. And it lasted for a while, but, not forever. By 1830, when Andrew Jackson became president, he signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, at which point they started going after the Potawatomis, who were in the southern part of the state, to move them out west across the Mississippi River. And if you ever go to Oklahoma, quite a few of them ended up in Oklahoma. First time I was there, they just kind of, what's going on here? But that's the story there. There was one exception, and that was a gentleman by the name of Leopold Pokagon. So if you go to some of the casinos in southern Michigan, they've got Pokagon in there. And they're related, part of this tribe that he was in charge of. And what happened in the early 1830s, he converted to Catholicism along with his family. And he asked for a priest out of Detroit to become their priest and their tribe. The priest then bought some land, and they were able to use that land. So they were under the assumption that they were going to be able to stay there forever. Eventually, when the Americans and their contractors went after them, and you need to move, well, they actually got a hold of one of the Supreme Court justices in Michigan, Ransom, who was on the state Supreme Court at the time, who said, no, these folks have met the charter, they should be allowed to stay, and if you guys keep chasing after them, Michigan's going to go after you. So they stopped, and they were able to stay. And that was right about the same time all of what was happening that I'm going to talk about with the Old Wing Mission, setting that up. So I'm sure that Chief Joseph Wakazoo Jr. and Leopold Pokagon were talking back and forth. It's not that far. And I really need to chase, that's another one of those rabbit holes I need to look at and see what was happening when, because I think there's an interesting story there also. As more and more settlement happened in western and southern Michigan, the first place that, because of the Treaty of 1821, the Native Americans got kicked out of was Grand Rapids. Those rapids were really valuable as an industrial source of power. So, the relatively large village that was where the Ford Museum and the the Grand Rapids Public Museum is, they were told to move, which they did. And then really until the 1830s, not much else was happening. And then suddenly in Grand Haven here in Saugatuck, or I should say Kalamazoo, you guys know what that's all about, and Singapore, and then Allegan, all of these cities were popping up. And then there was also a city called Superior that popped up in Lake Makatawa, and that was that Superior Point that I pointed out, right next to Waukazoo Woods. And these were some sort of combination, some speculators and some people from Kalamazoo that bought that land, and they put in a shipyard. At that time, the Holland Channel was open. They put in a shipyard, what else did they have? Sawmill, they had a small tannery, they had a blacksmith shop, and about a half a dozen houses, and they had this little town called Superior. And that lasted till 1840 when the guy who founded it died, and then everybody just kind of drifted away. But it was there for about 5 years, and it was enough to cause the Indians to need to move out. So in 1836, there was another treaty, and this is when Joseph Wakazoo Jr. took over from his father. And his father died in 1835, and Joseph became the chief. And right at that time, they decided, Henry Schoolcraft, who was the Indian agent in Michigan at the time, this is right before Michigan became a state, he got together a group of young chiefs and said, hey, how about you want to come to Washington, D.C., and we'll negotiate this new treaty? Which he did. Everybody was like, don't sign anything, but they did anyway, because they really got what should have been a really good deal. But the problem was that the Senate in the United States said, no, this is too good. So they started taking things away. One of which was, instead of being able to have land forever, they can only have it for 5 years, and then they could start kicking them out unless they started to, become Christians, buy the land, own the land, farm, settle, all of these things, very similar to what Leopold Pokagon did. Then, they would be allowed to stay. So the treaty went into effect. The money from the treaty went mainly to Rix Robinson and Louis Campow, who were the traders in the area, who had, given a lot of whiskey and other things to the natives at highly, inflated prices. There were going to be annual payments made at Mackinac Island for the next 20 years. And then there was money that was set aside for missions and schools and agricultural assistance. So Chief Wakazoo was kind of like, what the heck are we going to do about this? So enter George and Arvilla Smith. They were both born in Vermont, and they married in Vermont. They both studied to be school teachers, and they met each other teaching high school. And George always had an interest in becoming a missionary. So he studied with a preacher in Vermont. And right when he was finishing up, the preacher started talking more about life philosophy with George. And this preacher was a Mason. He was also somebody who drank a lot. And George was into temperance. He was also very anti-Mason. So when it was time to become a minister, he flunked his Latin exam or his Greek exam or something like that. He was lacking, exactly what you need on the frontier. But at that point, he knew that he was not going to become a missionary and a minister through this guy. So George was a little impulsive. So he and his wife and their infant son and Arvilla's sister decided to go west and come to Michigan. They had some family connection in here, which I've never seen again. I saw it once. And so they ended up sort of between Kalamazoo and Allegan. And they started several churches there. George was very successful. They were also teachers. George had also become a carpenter, and also he was a very good farmer. So he had all of those skills and was doing quite well as a circuit minister and being able to provide for his family. And then he met, Chief Wakazoo. And Michigan became a state in 1837. And suddenly there was all of this money available for missions. And since Chief Wakazoo had negotiated the treaty, he knew that if the Native Americans were allowed to get land and they settled and they became Christians and everything, they would be able to stay there because they were really afraid that the people that were forcing all the Potawatomis to move west of Mississippi River were going to be coming after them next. And he met Reverend Smith and asked him if he would set up a mission. And the word mission set off a light bulb, and Reverend Smith said yes. Arvilla was not overly happy about it, but she acquiesced to what her husband told her. And at the same time, Judge John Kellogg, who had immigrated to Allegan and was one of the early founders there, who was relatively wealthy. He was the second legislature from Allegan to Michigan, land speculator, very conservative Presbyterian. So he founded a group called the Western Michigan Society to benefit the Indians in 1838. So all of them tied in together. And then with Henry Schoolcraft, who was Chief Wakazoo's, as I say, frenemy. He was a friend as long as it was going in his direction, but as soon as he needed something different to help the white people, then he became the enemy. But they were able to purchase land, and this is the first time or the second time that Native Americans had been allowed to buy land directly from the federal government. And they were able to buy essentially two sections. It was 1,360 acres, and that was in that area that I showed you it's now in the city of Holland. And they decided to name it Odwing Mission after Chief Joseph Wakazoo Jr.'s uncle, who had recently passed. So I have, in the Holland collection, we have deeds that the land was first bought by Chief Wakazoo, and then it was transferred to various Native Americans in the area. So we have two of these deeds in our archives, and here's a copy of one of them. It's really cool because it's got Joseph Wakazoo's name on it. It has an X on it. Reverend Smith is one of the witnesses, and this was just working to get that 1,360 acres to the Native Americans so they could all say they had land, so that they wouldn't get kicked out of Michigan. So I'll pass this around if anybody wants to take a look at it. And that's one of our earliest artifacts that we have. That came from the city of Holland. So, that's 1937 when the museum was formed. That's like, number 1, number 7, something like that. So, I mean, it's just really cool. And one of those things you just kind of hold in your hand and say, yeah, this is cool. So, did I say that enough that I think it's really cool? Some of the Native Americans decided to buy more land, one of which was Peter Wakazoo. And here's a deed that we have from right after. That one's 1839. I think this one's 1840, where he bought some additional land. And I got all excited because I saw John Tyler's signature on there, and Rick Jenkins, the registrar, said, no, that's not really the president. That's, anybody who was selling land just signed the president's name. So kind of bummed. But yeah, this is for another 40 acres, somewhere in that area. I'm not quite sure where. These are a couple of tax receipts. So this is Joseph Wakazoo's tax receipt for 1841. This is Mary Wakazoo, who I think was his niece, for 1842. So Joseph Wakazoo owned, I think it's like $1.31. She owned like 30 cents for taxes for the year. Don't you wish? And then here's something that Chuck Lawrence put together. We had all of this area here that he knew that Native Americans had bought some of the land. He knew that Joseph Smith and Isaac Fairbanks had bought some of the land. So he was trying to put things together and see where everybody had bought land because you had the land, some of the land deeds that were still around. There was information, Ionia at the land office, and then also when the land was sold, it actually took a state act to allow it to be sold. And that's really cool because I also found a copy of that law here in the Saugatuck Museum. So when I was here for those 2 days, I found an awful lot of really cool stuff. But this is from the Holland Museum collection. Really hard to read, but this is section 3. Here's section 4. And there were some areas that were owned outside of that. There's some blanks in here, and I don't know if that was land that was owned by the tribe or if they didn't buy the entire section. I just don't know. It'd be fun to chase that down. I just, don't really have enough time, but maybe someday. Here's some other stuff that I found in your museum, which is really cool. This was a list of all of the Native Americans that were studying at the school that was set up. And this is before you had this book where you have everything in there. So he was literally, so Chuck was literally digging through the diaries and everything else, trying to figure out what was where. And the original diaries are at the Library of Congress and also at the University of Michigan. So, there's copies. We have, I believe, a full set of, stuff that's on microfilm, and you might have the same thing here. I don't know. But you have that. This is a list of all of the Native Americans who died. And where this becomes important is that there had been what probably was either typhoid or a cholera epidemic that happened in 1846 over a month. So from here to there, they all died in a month. And there's up to about here and to there, that area there is where they had a cemetery that I'll talk about in a few minutes, where the landing where Heinz Prickle is now, and that's where those people were buried. And then most, if not all of them, were moved when the Native Americans went north to Leelanau Peninsula. This is also cool because this is a list of how much money Reverend Smith had. He had been given $750 to start the mission, and then he was supposed to be getting like $300 or $400 a year. Nothing, literally nothing came. They would maybe get some old clothes. They might get $50 in cash from somebody, but it was really a struggle for them. And then as far as the mission itself, that $750 was used to build a cabin for the Smith family. There was a church that was built out of logs. Then they got $400 from, I believe, the federal government to build a school, which was in 1841. Isaac Fairbanks, who came along, built a cabin in 1844. The house that survives, which is the Smith house, was built in 1846. And there was a barn that was built, and the barn burned down in the Holland fire in 1871. So you have to think about how far that is from downtown Holland, and the fire burned that far. So the staff was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Elliott. I'm not quite sure what his background was, but he just showed up, and he's actually a signatory on that deed. So he was somebody who had some education and helped with setting everything up initially and getting all of the work done. A gentleman by the name of Jim Prickett who lived in Allegan. He was half native. He was somebody who was very reliable if he was sober. Unfortunately, Saturday night was his drinking night, and Sundays were not his best time. So when Reverend Smith needed him for a translator for church services, it just didn't work out too good. So he would be there for a while, he would get fired, come back, and it just wasn't working. Edward Cowles was a college-educated person from Oberlin College, also half native, who came along to be a school teacher there. He was promised that he would be paid, very rarely was, so he eventually left. Marianne Willard is somebody who had been trained by Reverend Ferry up on Mackinac Island, where Reverend Ferry had a mission up there for a while. And she came to be a teacher after Edward Coles lived. She was also half Native American, so she could translate. And she just one day decided to leave. She was not getting paid very much money. She was living with the Smith family, had lots of little kids, so she was also probably being the babysitter and everything else. And she just said this was too much, so she just ended up in Wisconsin. Dr. Osmond Goodrich was a doctor in Allegan, And he was able to get signed up as a farming instructor, and he did get paid, and he got paid $400 a year. Unfortunately, he didn't do much, and then he got sick, so he just kind of drifted away. Then Francis Mills, who was Reverend George Smith's brother-in-law, became the next farming instructor. This was a good gig. And he really didn't do much also. Then he also got sick, so then he had to quit. And then finally, Isaac Fairbanks became the farming instructor, and he was who the Native Americans wanted all along. He was somebody who had grown up in New York State, spoke the language fluently, was actually a good farmer. He was somebody who was a very good, humble person. They liked him a lot. Finally, when he became the farming instructor, then things finally got going. Eventually, he had a fight with Reverend Smith, then he left. I think Reverend Smith was a hard person to deal with at times, and there was a lot of people that had fights with him and then left. And then at that point, James McLaughlin took over as the farming instructor. But by this time, the Native Americans had decided they were going to go to the Leelanau Peninsula, and guess what? He was also a ship's captain, so he bought a ship, fixed up a ship instead of doing farming. So that's kind of what the staff of the mission was. So it lasted, really from 1839 to 1846. Very slow start. They thought they had money. They really didn't. The people that were supposed to build Reverend Smith's cabin didn't. Reverend Smith had to finish most of it. The school initially had lots of students that were there. And then what happened was that after Andrew Jackson was the president, we had President Martin Van Buren, who was also a Democrat, who was very much into moving the Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. And then suddenly Harrison was elected, and he was a Whig, and he said, this is BS. We're not going to move any more Native Americans west. So then the Native Americans said, okay, why are we on the mission then? Let's go back to our old style of life, which was mainly going back to living in Lake Makatawa, right next to what they referred to the landing. And they just started being there instead of at the mission. Some of the women, especially in the Wakazoo family, they really wanted to become Protestants. They really wanted to have their kids educated, and they really wanted to have the American life. So they stayed by the mission, but a lot of the other people were there just every now and then. In 1845, I talked about those payments being given at Mackinac Island. They were able to move them either to Grand Haven or else to Grand Rapids. So the Native Americans didn't have to go all that far up there for their money in the middle of the summer, because they were saying, well, if you want us to farm, we need to be here all the time to protect our land. And we have to leave for almost a month and a half in the middle of the summer. This just wasn't working out. So then Chief Joseph Wakazoo Jr. died probably of pneumonia in 1845, and he was replaced by his brother Peter. Peter was not the chief that Joseph Wakazoo Jr. or Sr. had been, but he tried and did a pretty good job. So I'd mentioned that a lot of the Odawa Indians were nominally Catholic, and what happened was that there was a priest in Grand Rapids, Father Viskowski, who decided to start including the Native Americans at the landing as part of his flock. And he was encouraged and sponsored by Rix Robinson and Louis Campow, who were the traders who sold alcohol to the Native Americans. So they really liked having all the Native Americans right there so they could make more money. Judge Kellogg agreed to donate 1 acre of land to the Odawa at the landing just so that they had some land there. And then a chief by the name of Masabe, Joseph Masabe, who was Potawatomi, arrived in 1842. And he was more of a traditional Native American. And he wanted to keep the Native American ways. He had nothing to do with farming, and really wanted to stay at the landing and doing everything he could to keep the Odawa, living the same lifestyle as he was. So they were able to talk Judge Kellogg into selling them an additional 15 acres of land to expand the landing so that really was going to be there, so nobody could take it away from it. Well, before you knew it, there was a Catholic church there and a cemetery established by Reverend Viskowski. Reverend Smith tried to cooperate with Reverend Wiskowski, but he really looked at those Native Americans as being his flock and wanted absolutely nothing to do with Reverend Smith. Reverend Wiskowski spoke the language, Reverend Smith did not. So between that and what would you rather go to a half-hour Catholic service if you really didn't understand what was going on, or an hour and a half Protestant service? What can you say? So the Catholics were a lot more popular. And there just was no cooperation between Father Wiskowski and Reverend Smith. The Dutch arrive, January 1, 1847, and this was Reverend Van Raalte scouting out the area, trying to figure out where he was going to move all of the Dutch people that wanted to come from the Netherlands. To take a step back, what happened is in 1835, there were 6 ministers that decided to rebel from the Reformed Church in the Netherlands. They were more conservative and they wanted to maintain more traditional ways. And this became a movement where about 20,000 Dutchmen became part of this movement. At first they were severely persecuted, then not quite so much, but then a famine and then a depression set in. So by 1846, things were pretty dire for these people. So Reverend Van Raalte caught typhoid. He told God if he survives, he's going to move his people to somewhere else. And that turned out to be the United States. So both he and Reverend Schulte, who moved out to Pella, Iowa, decided to lead this movement to Michigan, to the United States. So Reverend Van Raalte wrote a letter, said, I'm going to the United States. Anybody who wants to join me, come on over. Well, 2,000 people joined him in 1847, and it kept on going from there. So of the 20,000 people that were part of this movement at the time, at least half and probably even 2/3 of them ended up moving to the United States at this time. There was nothing here for them to do. There was really no food, no house, no anything. And it really just got to be hard the first year. A lot of people died, and they just kept on coming and coming and coming. And the Native Americans at first were quite supportive. With Reverend Van Raalte, when he was scouting out the area, they showed him the land. There was a lot of snow, and Van Raalte was kind of short, so quite often they would drag him around on their sleds or whatever and help him out. Van Raalte realized that the land here was quite fertile. He didn't quite realize how many marshes and swamps there were. However, being Dutch, they knew exactly what to do with those. So they started draining them, and so it really is some of the most productive farmland in Michigan. So he really did a decent job of picking a good place for the colony. But as the colony grew, the Native Americans that summer decided we're out of here, so they went north. And when they came back, the Dutch had taken their food, their shelters, their tools, their maple sugar equipment, and they looked at it as a gift from God, saying, the Lord has provided. This had all been neglected and thrown away by the Native Americans. Well, there was some compensation to some of them if they were caught by various Indians, but a lot of it they just got away with. And there was some retaliation by the Indians. They pilfered some food, they kidnapped a few people, and they needed to be rescued. Van Raalte offered some Native Americans some medical help, but it just got to the point that the Native Americans realized there's too many people here, we just need to get out of here. And then when the people came from the Netherlands to Zeeland, they brought smallpox with them, which is a death sentence to the Native Americans. 90% mortality rate. So they said, we're moving. And they really kept their separation because the Dutch were sick. The Native Americans, if you see somebody who looked like this picture with big, mean dogs, they kind of kept their distance. So by 1848, the Odawa had decided they were going to move north permanently to the Leelanau Peninsula. Reverend Smith decides to join them and continue to be their missionary. Once again, Arvilla was not real happy because she had this wonderful new house that she was living in, and suddenly they were going to go back to poverty again. But she did it for her husband. Then Reverend Smith and Isaac Fairbanks had a falling out. Unfortunately, Isaac Fairbanks got sick, and he had a substitute for him as the farmer instructor, but things just didn't work out the way that everybody would have hoped that they would. So they had a falling out, and Isaac Fairbanks was no longer the farming instructor. Maksabe was removed from the tribal register. He tried to kill Peter Wakazoo, and at that point, Peter said, "That's enough BS from this guy," kicked him out, so he lost all of his tribal benefits, and he died a year later. The Native Americans were able to sell the land, and they got a really good price for it. Essentially, it averaged out for $5 an acre for those 1,360 acres that they had gotten, and some of it sold for as much as $40 an acre. It took a few years to sell it all, and Raalte would have loved to have bought it all, but he was out of money. But it turned out good for them. It wasn't like it was stolen from them. They really made a nice return on it. And James McLaughlin, who was Arvilla Smith's cousin's husband, was the appointed farm agent. He was a ship manufacturer, shipbuilder, and a ship captain. So he bought a ship, fixed it up, and then all of the Native Americans and the Smith family headed north on June 1st, 1849. They took all of their dead with them. They took everybody out of the cemetery, and they took what they could. And they had 10 years of reasonably good living in the Holland area, and then going up to Northport, it really was another 10 years before things got really nasty for them, which eventually did happen, but at least it was, it did last a little bit longer. I think a bit of irony is that Reverend Van Raalte bought the Catholic Church. He didn't buy the land, but he bought the Catholic Church from Peter Wakazoo. And this is cool because this is actually Peter Wakazoo's signature. This is in the Joint Archives, which is the Hope College archives. And I just found it funny that he bought the church from the Native Americans and then used it as a shelter for Dutchmen as they came into the area. This is a map that we have in our collection. It's from approximately, it says 1849, it's probably about 1851. And just shows where all of the various settlements were, where the roads were. I mean, it's a nice sized map, and it's one of our treasures. Kind of hard to see it from back there. The Smith family had multiple children, and when they were at the mission, just because of the poverty that they had, all of the infants pretty much died. They had children early on, George Jr., Mary Jane, and Arvilla Aurelia, who all lived long lives. Esther Eliza, who was born next, she died at 3 years old, and at that point, the Smith family took a sabbatical, went back to Vermont for a while, and they came back with this tombstone for her, which is now in the Pilgrim Home Cemetery. And she's buried. Her body and several of her brothers and sisters were moved there in 1867, and it's something it's another one of the treasures that we need to figure out some way to protect it and preserve it in the Holland, in the Holland community. So, talking about the Old Wing Mission building, it was purchased by Isaac Fairbanks in 1854. Reverend Smith would not directly sell it to him. It took a little while. And then on and off for 100 years, it was part of the Fairbanks family. There's 2 additions to it. It was purchased by Chuck Lawrence in the 1980s. Became a bed and breakfast for a while. It's on the Michigan and the National Historic Register of Historic Places. Oldest building in Holland, immense historical value, and it was a private residence until 2023. Here's some pictures of it. In 1940, it was really falling apart right after the Depression. However, then in Holland, there was a real need for houses. So they were able to fix it up and make it into like 2 apartments. And that was in 1847, so it looked a lot nicer. Here's some of the brochures that we have from when it became the state historic marker. It was the bed and breakfast. This is one of the advertisings that they had. And here's a sign that's out in front of it now, talking about the Old Wing Mission. In 1997 was the 150th anniversary of the house, and also when the Dutch arrived. So they had some of the Native Americans from the Wakazoo family came for the 150th anniversary when Reverend Van Raalte arrived. They actually have the yoke that was used by the oxen that took Reverend Van Raalte. So the Harrington family had that, and it's now in the United Methodist Church downtown Holland. So they display that as one of their treasures. So that was actually here in a wagon. I don't think the wagon was quite 150 years old. And then they had some oxen that pulled the wagon there. So LG Energy Solutions has a major plant for making lithium-ion batteries in Holland. It started in 2012, 1,000 employees. In 2022, they announced they were going to double the size of the factory, and they're now starting it up. So they're going up to about 2,000 employees, and this is started up now. And these are all of the batteries, and a lot of it right now is going into Toyota hybrids and also the Toyota plug-ins. They've got a major contract with Toyota. So, like I'd mentioned earlier, I'd given a talk at the Holland Museum on Reverend Smith and the Old Wing Mission, the first version of this talk. Shortly thereafter, LG Energy Solutions announced that they were going to have another $3 billion expansion with Toyota. There was just no information that was out there. They had secrecy agreements with most people, and just really couldn't find out much. So what do? You send a letter to the editor, right? And I did that, and just saying, hey, this is an important building. We really need to make sure that it gets preserved. Just a little bit after that, LG announces that they had purchased the Old Wing Mission site, and everything was saying they're just going to bulldoze it. And I just, on a Friday afternoon, just started sending out emails to every historian that I knew, saying, hey, there's a city council meeting the next, I think it's Tuesday. Come on down, let's see what we can do. Sharpen your pitchforks, light the torches, and let's go. So we all went there, gave our 3-minute talks. Didn't really go too good, but at the same time, I met a lady by the name of Wendy Lagland, and I am the analytical person. She is the emotional person. She had contacted a whole bunch of groups in the state of Michigan trying to get people involved in helping us out. And a lot of these groups had already been contacted by LG and had given their permission saying, yeah, it's all right if you tear this down. You're right, there's not a whole lot of interest in the community. But she was able to get Brenda Rigdon, who is the chairman of the Michigan Historical Preservation Network, to write this letter, which showed up to the city council the day of this meeting. And they basically said, hey, this really is important from a state perspective, and you really should be preserving it. And Mayor Box gave a speech that was almost Shakespearean. It was hilarious. After all of us had failed miserably, he just gets up and pretty much just tells LG, okay guys, I know you're not really aware of this, but this really is something that is important to the city of Holland. It needs to be preserved. He goes on about being in the gym, having people interfere with his workouts, and he doesn't like this to happen. He's had at least 100 people come up to him in the last 3 days talking about it, and for each one of us who's up here giving talks, there's 100 people behind him. So, take this seriously, which they did. And they agreed to form a task force to figure out how to preserve it. And they're still waiting for the task force, but the building's there. I drove by it on my way here, so it's still standing, which is good news. So the current status is the building appears to be safe. It's surrounded by a fence. When I went to take some of these pictures, the security guard actually showed up to check on what I was doing, and I was standing by the street and everything, but I was really glad that they did it because it shows that they are really paying attention to it. This task force hasn't been set up yet, and talking to them, they have said, we're in the process of spending $5 billion on 2 major expansions. Give us some time. We've committed to save this. We're going to. And we just need time to get through some of this other stuff. And I'm like, okay. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the LG site, this is 48th Street. This is 40th Street. This little red dot there, that's the Old Wing Mission House. Plant number 1 is here. Plant number 2, which is what they're starting up. This is plant number 3, 5 stories high, 1 million square feet. There's some other buildings here and a lot of parking lots here. There's an area right next to it that they were first going to put a building just to the east. And I said, you really ought to try to keep that open because there's potentially other things that we could do with this. And so far they have. So that's really wonderful to see that, they are really listening to us. And I'm like, okay, let's wait and see what happens. Like I said, I'm a paranoid optimist, so I'm keeping an eye on it. The City of Holland is keeping an eye on it. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But it's going to take some money to restore it. What's the long-term viability of it? They see a future for it as being, part of their mission to the Holland area. It just all needs to be addressed. We also have Van Raalte Farms, which is a park that's a mile and a half away. And there's always a back plan that just in case things don't go right, if we can just move it to the park, then we can figure out what to do with it from there. And really for me, both options are good. It's just a matter of getting there and hopefully getting LG to pay for it all. So acknowledgments, friends of the Old Wing Mission, all of my colleagues that came with the torches and the pitchforks, and everybody got involved. It really was fun. I met a lot of people that I'd sort of knew, but just getting things going. Bob Zurigan, Bill Van Apeldoorn, Eric Hemingway, just all of the great background information they had. My colleagues at the Holland Museum, Rick Jenkins and Mary Elhart, who are in the archives, Ricky Levine, Michelle Sempion, who are the 2 executive directors. I also really thank you. I had so much fun in the archives those couple of days I was here that I'm just really glad that I was able to do that. I found a lot of really cool stuff. City of Holland has some people that really got involved, and I think some of you may know Anna Minabo, who is in charge of the historical projects for the City of Holland. She's just been a great source. Austin Metz, who was the reporter for the Holland Sentinel. We had 5 front page articles on what was going on with the Old Wing Mission. So he's been a great supporter, but he's also been able to keep his neutrality to some extent too. Various people within the state of Michigan, various archaeologists and other people that have just been helping out, giving advice. And also I really have to mention a couple people at LG Energy's Solutions, Roger and Valerie, who they're kind of stuck behind a rock in a hard place in a lot of ways because, they're part of the company. I really think they want to see the thing preserved. It's just a matter of going through the pathway and just doing things that, we can get to where we really want to get. So that's it. Sorry I went a little over.